Welcome to part 2 of our last episode in this week's Women Techmaker series. It's been really rewarding for us to talk to so many talented women who are innovating in the tech space this week. And today we're excited to have yet another talented woman techmaker, Hilary Mason, who's the chief scientist at Bitly, joining us from New York City. Before we turn it over to Hilary, by way of introduction, my name's April Anderson. I'm an industry director here at Google, and I'm working to bring Google's advertising solutions to our top partners in the retail market. I've been at Google now for about 10 years and went to school just down the road at Stanford University. I'm joined here by my colleague, Kathryn Hurley, who I'll turn it over so she can do a quick introduction.
Hey everyone, my name is Kathryn Hurley. I'm a developer programs engineer at Google, and specifically I work on Google Compute Engine. And as a developer programs engineer, I help developers use the Compute Engine API. So for example, I write sample code, I speak at conferences, you might have seen me at London Strata this year, for example, and I answer questions on the forum and Stack Overflow. And prior to Google, I got a master's in web science at the University of San Francisco. And so now at this point, I'd love to turn it over to Hilary so she can tell us a little bit about herself and give us a little bit about her background.
Sure. Hi. First, thanks for inviting me. It is really exciting to be talking to both of you about things I think we're all pretty interested in. So this is really cool. And just to introduce myself briefly, I'm Hilary Mason. I'm the chief scientist at Bitly. Bitly is a URL shortening analytics company, but the work we really do is about understanding human behavior through the lens of social sharing. So we look into the data generated by our analytics service and try and learn things about humans, which is pretty interesting because my academic background is in computer science, but my whole life I've also built things. And so finally I'm in a position where I'm both building things and doing interesting research. I also co-founded a nonprofit called Hack NY that helps young developers find interesting opportunities in the New York creative tech economy. The tagline actually is from my co-founder, Chris Wiggins, and we say to save kids from the street, but we mean Wall Street. And I'm also involved in making trouble in a bunch of other ways in New York on Mayor Bloomberg's advisory council, and also I'm a member of the Hackerspace NYC Resistor.
Wow, that is a really awesome background. You do a lot of amazing work. So you briefly touched upon Bitly, but do you mind going into a little bit more detail about what the company does, maybe how it got started?
Sure. So Bitly was a total accident. It was actually a feature of another product that was a web product around intellectual discourse around shared media experiences, but it totally failed. But what did succeed was this little piece of it for sharing bits of content called Bitly. And we actually have a sister company called Chartbeat that uses some of the same technologies, and Chartbeat is real-time web analytics for publishers. So nobody really planned Bitly as a company. It's not like someone woke up one day and said, oh, I have a great idea for the world's best URL shortener. But once that happened, we started to build it, and we realized that the value would always be in the data set. And so eventually we developed a business around that, and that's our enterprise analytics business, where folks who run large brands are celebrities. Basically, anyone who either publishes a lot of content to the social web or has a lot of content about them published to the social web pay us for branding on their short links and also a whole set of analytics about how their stuff is doing. So we have these two sides, the data and the business, and the work I do sort of sits in the middle.
Very cool. And how would you characterize the Bitly user experience, for example? And what do you think that Bitly is doing that contributes to the seamless content sharing that we see on Bitly?
Yeah, so Bitly is really the best way to outsource your memory and the content you want to save and find later. So you can go to Bitly as a consumer, of course it's all free, and you can save things, tag things, put notes on things, and then you can find out how many other people also saved those things or were interested or clicked on those things. And you can come back and search for that stuff later, and you can share easily out to many different networks. So we see Bitly as the hub that sits between all of your social sharing behavior.
Great, very cool. Hilary, I'm really interested to learn more about what it means to be a data scientist. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means? What does a data scientist do? And in your role as a chief scientist at Bitly, what does your typical day look like? Take us through that.
Okay, so those are two different questions. So I'll start with the one about data science, which has only really been around as a profession for a few years. And I'm pretty privileged to consider myself part of the larger worldwide conspiracy to create the profession, or at least help support it. I think data science deserves a new job title because it's not anything that we've never been able to do before, but it's three behaviors that we've never combined into one professional before. And those three behaviors are, first, being able to do math and build models that represent the real world. The second one is being able to write code or engineer the systems that support those models, and sometimes to do it at large scale, as you guys certainly do, and as we do at a scale as well. And then third, to ask good questions and be creative enough to communicate what you've learned back to anybody. And that's often the hardest thing to find, especially combined with someone who knows math and is an engineer as well. But that's sort of the practice that I've seen evolve over the last couple of years. As to what I actually do, that's a very good question. I'm really privileged to work with a brilliant team of scientists, engineers, and artists. And my job is mainly to coordinate the various research questions that we're investigating, the systems we're working on, and to work with our product and business to prioritize our work appropriately. So I see our role as really laying down the path where our company will go in the next 6 months or the next year.
That's great, and I definitely want to hear more about that, but also want to hear from Kathryn, who has a few questions for you on big data, because that's a very interesting topic for us as well.
Yes, if you don't mind, switching gears a little bit. So as a data scientist, you work with lots of data. What I'm first kind of interested in hearing about is what kind of data is gathered by Bitly from your users.
So we primarily see three kinds of data. We see the save and share events. So somebody shortens a link or saves it in bitly.com. We see the entire set of clicks on that link once it's shared out. And that includes things like the location of where people are clicking on things from, the referral, which social network it's getting traffic from, the user agent, so what kind of device and stuff like that. And we actually go and crawl the full content of each link. And we do a bunch of analysis on that as well. So we primarily work with those three types of data.
Okay, yeah, that's some pretty interesting data that you gather.
Definitely.
And, yeah. And just to give our audience an idea of just how much data Bitly has and stores, and how much data you get to play with every day.
Yeah, so we see tens of millions of links a day, hundreds of millions of clicks on those links, and then a lot of content. I don't remember off the top of my head how big it is, but it's moderately big.
Moderately big. It sounds pretty big to me. And so that brings up a good question. Hot topic right now is big data, and I know you have an opinion about big data because I watched some of your talks. What do you think about big data?
So I think the term big data is a little difficult because it's so hard to define. So some people think big data is when it won't fit in Excel anymore, and some people think big data is when you need more than one node to actually operate over something or store it. What I think is actually fundamentally new and interesting about big data is that it lets you it reduces the friction to working with data. So it lets you ask a question and get the answer back before you've forgotten why you've asked that question in the first place. So I think the advantages to using these big data type technologies are really human advantages. They're not so much technical advantages. And I also, every so often find myself at a conference with astrophysicists or, people who work in bioinformatics, and they look at our data and they say, hi, you thought that was big. We had to invent a new kind of hard drive to store our stuff. So those are the people who are really pushing the edge of big data.
Yeah. And so it sounded like you have a couple tools that you like to use to work with big data. Can you share what some of those are?
Sure, though they're fairly embarrassing and old-fashioned. My favorite way to work with data whenever possible is on the command line using the bash tools, so grep and awk. If you look on Bitly's GitHub page, we actually have some nice scripts you can run to do histograms on the command line and do some really basic sampling and get a sense of your data just from that. That's not always possible, though, so I'm a huge Python nerd. We use NumPy, SciPy, and scikit-learn. We also do have a Hadoop cluster here at Bitly. It's not my favorite piece of infrastructure, but we do use it, and it works very well for what we use it for.
Cool. Thanks for sharing.
Of course.
And so working with all this data, you probably have a lot of insights and make a lot of interesting discoveries with this data. Can you share what your most interesting discovery is with all the Bitly data?
It's really hard to pick just one.
Okay,
but one thing we put up on our blog today was we looked at the half-life of content by topic, and it turns out that most content actually has very similar half-lives, and a half-life is the time it takes for a link to get half the clicks it'll ever get. So just sort of looking at how attention to it is modified over time. But one kind of content is much shorter, and that's sports. So once sports news is out of date, nobody cares about it.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Very true.
Not really a surprise, but good to see it proven in the data.
That's so cool. And you make these discoveries, but how do they actually influence Bitly as a product? Do you see any changes in the UI or in the back end? Or are you just working with the data and having fun?
Well, it's all of the above, actually. Okay. So we tend to, ask a research question, and that might be something like, can we build a model of canonical social sharing? So is there a consistent way that content is shared through different social networks? And so we'll go out and say, okay, how do we know when we've won? How do we know when we've done that, when we've actually answered that question? And then two, is it scalable? So can we actually build a system to do this? Most of our products are real-time analytics products. So is it possible to do this in real time? And then if so, what should the product look like? And so that question was actually not hypothetical. It was what we spent most of last year working on. And we actually released an experimental product called Realtime, which is at the domain rt.ly, where you can go in and look, and it's showing you the stories that are getting that initial spike of attention, and you can now go in and see the actual maps of attention over time. So that's an example of something that has gone from research to infrastructure to experiment and soon to Bitly product.
Awesome. It's always fun to see the work that you do get put into the product, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. We're also opening up some of the APIs there as well, which I'm pretty excited about.
Awesome. I like APIs. That's what I work on every day. All right, one more question for you, and then I'll hand it. I feel like I'm hogging the show. No. But finally, have you hit any walls recently, or have you come across any challenges with Bitly's data? And how have you overcome those challenges?
So that's a difficult question, because I think most of my time is spent overcoming challenges. And a lot of the time they're human challenges. So, somebody is after something different than what we're after, or we're not quite coordinated within the company about what we're trying to do. And sometimes they're technical challenges. And I can think of examples of both just from today. One being that we defined some key business metrics for one of our apps, and it turned out they were getting written to one data store and not another, and so I spent a long time trying to track that down. In general, the ways I try to work around these things are to always talk to people in a very positive way. So not to get frustrated or upset, but rather to say, like, okay, here's our problem. How do we solve this problem? And I'm really fortunate, again, to work with a lot of smart people who are really nice. In fact, our #1 hiring rule has always been, don't hire assholes. And so that tends to work out pretty well.
That's a good rule.
Yeah, it's a good mantra. So Hilary, I think I would love to hear more about your role and some of those challenges and also some of those opportunities as you work as a chief scientist at Bitly. How do you really balance wearing sort of the technical hat and the technical aspects of your role with the things that are more business oriented?
That's a really good question because it's something I'm still learning how to do. And when I started at Bitly 3 years ago, I was writing code every day. And it's, we were such a small team that everyone knew what everyone was doing, and it was pretty clear where we were going. We had only, one thing to do, and that was keep scaling, right? And now we've got a couple of different products, a larger business, a lot more people. And so it has been a challenge to learn how to grow with the company and to grow my team from just me to now 9 people. The ways I try to do that are generally, it sounds really trite, but actually applying the scientific method. So even in product or business problems, saying, okay, here's my theory. What experiments can we do given the data we have available or the people we have available or the resources we have available to answer this question? And, can we try something and see what happens and then try something else? And that, is generally how I've thought about the world and has worked pretty well.
That's great. And how do you really infuse that with your team, right? This is an industry and certainly a product that requires constant iteration, constant innovation. How do you really foster that creativity with your teams?
I try and lead by example, and what I mean there is to have lots of bad ideas, because you have to have a lot of ideas to have any good ideas, and if you don't even try to articulate those the bad ones, if you're afraid to do it or you're going to be embarrassed, then you're going to miss out on the good ones. Or when you say something that might not be the best idea, maybe one of your colleagues can say, well, that's total bullshit, but this other twist on it might actually work. And so we try and keep that kind of open environment, and also keep in mind that a lot of the best ideas don't come from our researchers with PhDs in math. They come from the people who are working on our community support team, because they're actually there working with customers all the time. And so within the company, we try and create a culture that ideas come from anywhere, questions can come from anywhere, and no one should be afraid to have bad ones or ask silly questions. Yeah, and I do a lot of that.
Yeah. No, I think it's something we all kind of strive to do, right? Keep that customer voice infused in everything that we do. As a bit of a tangent on data, I'd love to hear, how do you actually keep track of your own data within Bitly when you get this kind of feedback? Like, what are the mechanisms that you use to really make sure that you're keeping your finger on the pulse of how the product's doing and what the customers are saying about it, your own sort of big data, as it may be?
Right. So one of our responsibilities is the not so sexy area of business analytics, right? That is even figuring out what metrics correlate to the kinds of behaviors we want to see. And for some things, it's really easy, right? So you have a certain amount of money and you watch that go up, and that's great, right? Your problem solved. But for a lot of things, it's not that simple. So one of the projects I'm working on is growing our platform and working on API design. And we start to think about, okay, what kind of platform users do we want? How do we want to understand their behavior on our system? On the technical side, if there are any technical folks in the audience, we have a consistent development metaphor within Bitly for all of our systems, which is you have a stream of data, you have a queuing system, you have queue readers that read out of that queue, you have some kind of API layer, and you have an application. And what that lets us do is take those streams of data and put them in places where we can analyze them pretty easily, or hang things off of them that can fire events when metrics happen. And so we track everything we can in StatsD and Graphite. We also have our own dashboard called the Aquarium. We're big on the fish theme. And we just try and make that available to everyone in the company so that anyone can ask a question and find that answer without having to ask someone else.
That's great to have that transparency. I would love to hear a little bit more too. I mean, you are doing so many things at Bitly, and you have such an impressive background. What do you think of your early experiences really prepared you most for your current role? And are there any sort of experiences that you'd recommend for people who are really looking to build a career in tech and leadership within the tech space?
Yeah. That's another good question. So I have a mix of experiences. Some of them are theoretical and academic, and many of them were much more, so I really do like video games. So at one point I built a system to gather a lot of data out of video games. And then it turned out it actually had commercial value, but it was a total accident, and I was pretty naive about how I had developed it. So my only advice there is that you have to actually do things and not be afraid to do things that are not perfect. If you do things and they're not that great, people, for the most part, just ignore them. But if you do things and they're really interesting, and if you're interested in something, there are other people out there who are going to be interested in it. The second piece of advice, and this is something I learned probably a little bit too late, is that you need to build a community. And in New York, we've been really fortunate to see huge growth in the number of people working in tech or in companies that have a large tech component over the last 5 years. But we've also done a lot to sort of build a data community here. And we've gotten people from, where I say we, it's mostly me and a few other people who said, you know, we want this to exist in New York and we want New York to have this voice. So we went out and found people who shared that motivation and that interest and just started introducing them to each other and making sure that we have a meetup every few months where we get together with some beer so people are a little relaxed and they can talk about what they're working on or what they're thinking about. But that community is really important.
No, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing that too. I think it is important to be active and try new things and really sort of put yourself out there. So it's great advice to give. I'm going to turn it back over to Kathryn because we want to hear a little bit more also about some of your recent presentations and some of the things that you've talked about in terms of prioritizing research.
Yep.
Sure.
if we have enough time. So yes, like I said, I was watching some of your recent presentations, one in particular at Devs Love Bacon, which is a very awesome title for a conference. And at that conference, you talked about, and sorry, I'm reading off my notes here. I just want to get the question right. So you talked about several steps in the data analysis process. So that included finding, scrubbing, exploring, modeling, and interpreting the data. And so I was just curious if you had any tips for data scientists who are just starting out in this data analysis process, and if you could suggest any tools or any kind of material that could help them get started in the field.
Sure. So I have to say that I love that you watched that talk because I had given a 3-hour machine learning algorithm tutorial at a conference the year before. And the gentleman who organized the Bacon conference attended, and he liked it. And so he said, will you come to my conference and give the talk? And I said, sure, I'd love to. And then when I got there, he said, oh, and you have 30 minutes. And so I had this 3-hour tutorial planned, and I was like, oh, you know, how do I condense 3 hours of material into something that'll be entertaining and interesting for 30 minutes and actually not lose the value in the presentation? So that was an artifact of a lot of stress and jet lag, but I think it came out okay. And the process you talked about is something, it's from a document I co-wrote with my colleague Chris Wiggins, who's also a co-founder of HackNY, a few years ago now, where we realized that there really was no canonical statement of what a data scientist does or even how you look at data in a non-scientific way. And so we wrote this down, and it is indeed this, you get data, you know, you scrub it, you model it, you analyze it, and you interpret it or make it interpretable for other people. It's pretty simple and seems obvious now, but at the time, I hadn't seen it written down like that. So for young data scientists who want to start to explore, the first thing you need is data. And there's actually a lot of data out there. A lot of it's public data. You can look at some of the government data. Even Bitly has a public data set of all the 1.usa.gov clicks. So we power the federal government URL shortener. It's all public data. It's a good way to play with social data if you're interested in that. Or you can scrape it. So a lot of people do that. I just did a really fun little side project where I scraped all the menus for non-fast food restaurants in New York City, and then tried to plot clusters of different restaurant types. So I found Chinatown, and I found where you should go for Thai food. It was all really to find better cheeseburgers, which has mostly worked. But the data's out there. And so if you can think of a question you would ask if you had some data, or the other way around, so find some data and then look at it and try and see what stands out to you. then you can start looking at different tools. You can even start in Excel, so it's sort of a dirty secret, but a lot of people do great work in Excel. And when you move up from that, you can go either to R if you're a statistician by training, or Python if you're more a computer scientist. Load that data up, and especially if you're in an environment like IPython with the interactive notebook, you can start graphing it and tweaking things and seeing what you can find there. And then my next recommendation is get a GitHub account and put whatever you did up there, and then let people tell you why it's wrong. Because you will learn a lot, and they will think it's cool, and you'll get a lot of good feedback and start to meet people who are also interested in what you're interested in.
And you create a lot of cool visualizations as well with the data. So are there any libraries that you like to use to create these visualizations?
Well, at Bitly, we are huge fans of D3.js. In fact, my colleague Mike Dewar wrote a short O'Reilly book on getting started with D3. So if you'd like to check that out, we use it on our real-time site, and it's a really good book. Otherwise, so data visualization in the service of usefulness, where it really doesn't have to be pretty, I still mostly use matplotlib in Python, which is a very simple way to make fairly uninteresting graphs.
Cool. All right. Maybe one more question? Okay. And then I just want to ask about the prioritizing research blog post that you wrote recently. So people that might not be familiar with it, I'll just cover it real quick. So you have 5 different steps for prioritizing research, and that's you first state a question, then you ask yourself, how do you know when you've won? And correct me if I'm not getting these right, please. Then you assume the question was answered correctly. What are the first things that you're going to build with it? And then if everyone in the world uses it, let's see, how does that change human behavior? And the last one, my favorite one, is what's the most evil thing that can be done with this? So first, my question is, what about that last question? Like, why did you include that?
So I included that because it lets you turn the work upside down and think about the implications of what you're doing in a really creative way. And just getting people to brainstorm about, how they could do something terrible with what they're working on really makes them think about it in a new way. And we've had a lot of really good ideas come out of that. I do want to add that we're not evil. We're generally trying to build very good things and sort of build things that make the world more like the world we want to live in. But that question tends to get people to think creatively about the research in a way that nothing else I've found works.
That's great.
Cool.
All right. I think we're wrapping.
Yes, I think we'll wrap up.
Yeah.
So I just want to say thank you so much, Hilary, for joining us. It was
Well, thank you both. This was super fun.
Yeah, yes. It was really nice to meet you, Hilary. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm fascinated and very much inspired by all the work that you've done in your career thus far. So thank you for coming here.
Well, likewise, and thank you for hosting.
Absolutely.
Yep, it's great. Learning so much great information from you. And I guess, should I wrap up? Yeah. Sorry. And to our viewers, thank you so much for joining us for this final episode of the Women Techmakers series. And all of our programming can be viewed and shared on Google Plus or Google Developers Live. Tell us what you think about this series by hashtagging your comments with WTM, and keep an eye out for more Women Techmakers and Google Developers Live events.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.